Long before a backbone pressed its weight into mud, animals had already begun testing the border between sea and land. That border was not a line on a map. It was a moving zone of wet sand, tidal pools, exposed flats and shallow channels, alternately flooded and uncovered. For creatures accustomed to the support of water, even a few minutes in air created new problems. Yet it also created opportunity. The oldest chapter of animal life on land is therefore not a story about a heroic fish crawling onto a beach. It begins much earlier, and with animals that left almost no bodies behind. Trace fossils preserve movement where bodies vanished. Grooves, trails and trackways written into sediment. Some Cambrian traces from settings exposed to air have been interpreted as evidence that soft-bodied or mollusk-like animals could survive brief excursions outside the water more than 500 million years ago. That interpretation is still being tested because trace fossils record behavior more directly than identity. A trail can show that something moved, paused, turned, or crossed a surface, but it may not preserve enough information to tell us exactly what made it. The important point is that the landward edge of the sea was being explored long before permanent terrestrial ecosystems existed. For most of the Cambrian, the continents would have looked shockingly empty to us. There were no forests, no grasses, and no birds. Wind crossed exposed rock and sediment with little to slow it. Rivers behaved differently without deep root systems to hold banks together. On wet surfaces, thin microbial communities could form films and crusts. But the landscape lacked the three-dimensional biological architecture that later plants would create. Animals entering this world faced gravity without buoyancy. Water helps support the body. Air does not. A creature that moved comfortably across a submerged surface could sag, collapse, or strain its limbs when exposed. Gills also work best when wet. Delicate respiratory surfaces can dry quickly, and feeding mechanisms that rely on sucking or moving water become less useful in air. Temperature and moisture changed faster on land than beneath the water. A shallow pool could heat in sunlight, cool at night, concentrate salts through evaporation, or disappear entirely. The shore was physically unstable, but that instability rewarded flexibility. Any animal able to tolerate short exposure could reach food, avoid aquatic predators, or move between pools that others could not use. By the Ordovician and Silurian, the continents were beginning to change. Small plants and their fungal partners spread across damp ground. They were low compared with later forests, but their ecological effect was enormous. They trapped sediment, altered weathering, and added organic matter to primitive soils. The land was slowly becoming less like bare geology and more like habitat. Arthropods were especially well suited to take advantage. Their external skeletons provided structural support, their jointed limbs already functioned as levers, and many lineages had respiratory systems that could be modified for air. Fossil evidence from the Silurian records terrestrial myriapods and arachnid relatives. They were not simply visitors to the shore. Some were living in non-marine environments. The first land food webs were modest. Small plants, microbial films, and decaying organic material supplied resources. Tiny detritivores fed on dead matter. Predators followed prey. Fungi and microbes decomposed what died. Long before there were vertebrate footsteps, the ecological machinery of a terrestrial ecosystem was assembling close to the ground. This is one reason the phrase, "life moved onto land," can be misleading. There was no single invasion. Different lineages crossed the boundary at different times, for different reasons, and with different degrees of commitment. Some may have emerged only briefly. Others became residents. Still others evolved on land and never again depended on the sea in the same way. The coast itself kept moving. Continents drifted, sea levels rose and fell, and sediment created broad flats where marine and freshwater conditions could meet. Estuaries, lagoons, and river margins became evolutionary laboratories. They offered both danger and refuge. Shallow water, exposed banks, abundant organic debris, and strong environmental change over short distances. By the Silurian, arthropods had transformed the idea of what an animal habitat could be. A predator no longer needed to swim. A scavenger could follow the smell of decay across damp ground. A millipede-like detritivore could process plant litter. These were small steps in scale, but immense steps in ecology. Land also created a new kind of landscape memory. A footprint could dry and harden before burial. A burrow could cut through soil rather than seabed. Organic matter could accumulate where water did not immediately disperse it. The fossil record of terrestrial life is still fragmentary, but it preserves moments when living bodies interacted with surfaces under open air. The animals that came first were not preparing the way for vertebrates. Evolution has no plan, but their presence changed the opportunities available to later arrivals. They created prey. They helped break down plant material. They altered soils. A fish approaching the water's edge in the Devonian did not face a truly empty continent, and by then, plants were no longer low films and tiny stems. Roots were penetrating sediment more deeply. Vascular tissues were moving water upward. Leaves expanded the surface area available for photosynthesis. In some regions, tree-sized plants were beginning to build the world's first forests. That transformation matters because the vertebrate move toward land occurred inside a world that plants and arthropods had already begun to engineer. Rivers carried woody debris. Shallow wetlands became crowded with stems and roots. Seasonal pools could be rich in food but poor in oxygen. Shorelines were increasingly complex rather than bare. The old image of a single fish escaping a drying pond is too simple. There may have been many pressures and advantages: access to prey, movement through vegetation-choked shallows, survival in low-oxygen water, short overland crossings, refuge from larger aquatic predators, and the simple fact that shallow water demanded a body that could push against the bottom. The first stages of the vertebrate transition were therefore probably not about becoming terrestrial. They were about becoming better at living in difficult water. Stronger fins, air-breathing, mobile heads, and robust ribs could all be useful before an animal spent much time on dry ground. That is where the next part of the story begins. Not on a beach, but in warm Devonian wetlands where fish already possessed many of the structures that would later make walking possible. There is also a preservation bias built into this opening chapter. Hard-shelled arthropods and firm trackways are much more likely to survive than delicate, soft-bodied visitors to exposed shores. That means the first fossil we recognize is unlikely to mark the literal first attempt. The transition probably began as repeated behavioral experiments at the water's edge, many of them invisible to us, because neither the animal nor its trail survived burial, erosion, and hundreds of millions of years of geological change. The footprints would come later. The anatomical experiments began first. By the early Devonian, terrestrial ecosystems were still low and unfamiliar, but they were no longer empty. Plants covered more ground, fungi threaded through soils, and arthropods occupied niches that had not existed a few tens of millions of years earlier. The land was becoming a place where an animal could feed, hide, hunt, and reproduce without returning to the open sea. Among the best-known early terrestrial animals were myriapods. A fossil called Pneumosmus from rocks in Scotland has often been cited as one of the earliest body fossils, showing an animal adapted to breathe air. Its exact age has been debated, but it belongs to the broad Silurian-Devonian transition when arthropods were clearly establishing themselves on land. Arachnid relatives were there as well. Trigonotarbids, extinct spider-like predators, appear in Paleozoic terrestrial deposits. Early scorpion-like forms complicate the picture because some ancient scorpions may have been aquatic or amphibious, while later lineages were unmistakably terrestrial. The transition happened across many branches, not as one synchronized event. Arthropods had several advantages. Their exoskeletons resisted collapse, jointed appendages could support the body, and the waxy outer layers that later became important in many terrestrial forms reduced water loss. But none of these features appeared because land was waiting to be conquered. They emerged through modifications of structures that already existed for life in water or moist environments. Breathing air also evolved more than once. Book lungs, tracheal systems, and other respiratory structures represent different solutions to the same physical problem: extracting oxygen while protecting delicate exchange surfaces from drying. Air contains abundant oxygen compared with poorly oxygenated water, but access is useful only if the body can keep those respiratory tissues moist and move gases efficiently. The changing plants made terrestrial life easier. Root systems stabilized some soils and altered river channels. Leaf litter accumulated. Dead wood created shelter. Tiny spaces beneath stems and within damp soil maintained humidity. The first forests, which became established later in the Devonian, multiplied these microhabitats dramatically. Small arthropods could live inside a world that to a vertebrate still looked structurally hostile. A millipede only centimeters long could follow humid cracks through litter. A predatory arachnid could wait beside a root. A tiny animal did not need to support the weight of a meter-long body or pump blood through a large vertical frame. This difference in scale is easy to underestimate. The invasion of land did not require one universal set of adaptations. A millimeter-sized animal and a large fish faced different mechanical challenges. For arthropods, the exoskeleton and jointed legs were already useful. For vertebrates, the internal skeleton had to be reorganized so that muscles and bones could resist gravity in a new way. Food also mattered. Terrestrial arthropods could feed directly on decaying plants, fungi, microorganisms, and one another. Vertebrate predators arriving later would find a landscape that already contained mobile prey. The land was beginning to reward animals capable of leaving the water, even if only for short distances. Some early excursions may have remained tied to wet conditions. Coastal flats, floodplains, and river margins could allow animals to move on saturated sediment without dealing with the full dryness of inland environments. The shift from aquatic to terrestrial life was likely a gradient of behaviors rather than a switch. A creature could breathe air yet still reproduce in water. It could walk underwater but struggle on dry land. It could feed on land while hiding in water. It could survive drought by moving between pools. Each of these behaviors could be favored separately, allowing a patchwork of adaptations to accumulate before permanent terrestrial life was achieved. Plants were changing the atmosphere and the landscape at the same time. Devonian forests increased biological productivity on land and accelerated weathering. Nutrients carried into rivers and seas affected aquatic ecosystems. Soil formation deepened. The continents became physically rougher, biologically richer, and chemically more active. That transformation had costs. Increased nutrient runoff has been discussed as one contributor to episodes of oxygen depletion in Devonian waters. Wetlands could become stagnant. Seasonal pools could be warm and oxygen poor. For a fish able to gulp air, such conditions were less threatening than they were for a fish dependent entirely on dissolved oxygen. Air breathing was not invented by the first tetrapods. Many fishes evolved ways to use atmospheric oxygen, and several living fish lineages still do. Lungs and lung-like organs have deep evolutionary roots among bony fishes. The crucial point is that breathing air could evolve for life in water before it became useful on land. The same is true of limb-like appendages. Fins that could brace the body against a river bottom or maneuver through dense vegetation did not need to function as legs on dry ground to be advantageous. Evolution often reuses structures built for one context in another. That principle changes how we should picture the Devonian transition. There was no moment when nature decided to build a land animal. Instead, bodies already adapted to shallow, complex water acquired features that later proved useful outside it. By the Middle and Late Devonian, lobe-finned fishes had diversified into forms with robust internal fin bones. Their fins were not hands, but inside them were bones arranged in patterns that foreshadowed the upper arm, forearm, and wrist of tetrapods. Meanwhile, the land continued to fill with small legs. Arthropods crawled through vegetation and litter, while vertebrate evolution was still experimenting in the shallows. The ecological destination existed before the vertebrate machinery was ready. To understand how that machinery formed, we have to return to the water and look at animals that were unquestionably fish. The first terrestrial ecosystems also changed the chemistry of the land itself. Burrowing, feeding, and decomposition mixed organic material into developing soils, while plant roots and fungi opened pathways for water and minerals. These processes were tiny compared with later forests, but they made the land more habitable in a cumulative way. By the time vertebrates began exploiting shorelines, they were entering landscapes already modified by generations of organisms too small to dominate the fossil record. The surprising thing is how much of walking began there. The Devonian is often called the age of fishes, and the name is justified. Oceans, rivers, and lakes contained an extraordinary diversity of jawed and jawless vertebrates. Armored placoderms, early sharks, ray-finned fishes, and lobe-finned fishes occupied ecosystems that were changing as quickly as the continents around them. Tetrapods emerged from within the lobe-finned branch. That does not mean a modern coelacanth or lungfish simply turned into a salamander. It means that the ancestors of tetrapods shared ancestry with those living groups and belonged to a broader radiation of sarcopterygian fishes, in which fleshy fins contained substantial internal bones and muscles. One famous Devonian fish, Eusthenopteron, helped reveal these similarities long before transitional forms were well known. Its fin skeleton included a single proximal bone, followed by paired bones farther out, an arrangement that resembles the one-bone, two-bone pattern of tetrapod limbs. Yet Eusthenopteron remained thoroughly aquatic and was not a walking animal. Later forms narrowed the anatomical gap. Panderichthys had a flattened body and skull suited to shallow water. Its paired fins were robust, and its eyes were positioned toward the top of the head. These features make sense in environments where an animal spent time close to the bottom in water that may have been shallow, vegetated, or periodically oxygen-poor. Then there is Tiktaalik rosie, discovered in Arctic Canada and described in 2006. About 375 million years old, Tiktaalik combined fish traits such as scales and fin, rays with a flattened skull, a mobile neck, strong ribs and fin bones capable of supporting the body in ways that ordinary fish fins could not. The importance of Tiktaalik is not that it was the fish that walked onto land. That phrase is memorable but misleading. Its anatomy shows a mixture of features expected near the fish-tetrapod transition, and many of those features were useful in shallow water. It may have propped itself up on the bottom or moved through very shallow channels rather than strolling across dry ground. Its neck is especially revealing. In many fishes, the skull is tightly connected to the shoulder girdle. Tiktaalik shows a reduction of that connection, allowing the head to move more independently. In shallow water, a mobile head could help an animal raise its snout to breathe or strike at prey without turning the entire body. The ribs were also stronger than those of many aquatic relatives. On land, ribs help support internal organs against gravity, but in shallow water, they could stabilize the trunk during bottom-supported movement. Again, the same structure can serve one function before becoming important for another. Tiktaalik's front fin contained a humerus, radius, and ulna, plus smaller distal bones arranged in a flexible region comparable in broad pattern to a wrist. The fin still ended in rays rather than fingers, but it could bend in a way that allowed the animal to push against a solid surface. Later study of its pelvis showed that the hind portion of the body was more robust than originally appreciated. The transition toward four-limbed propulsion was already underway before true legs with digits appeared. The old idea of a front-heavy fish dragging itself forward while useless hind fins trailed behind is no longer sufficient. Why would such a fish need to push against the bottom? Devonian wetlands offered many possibilities. Shallow channels could be crowded with stems and roots. Floodplains changed seasonally. Water could become oxygen-poor. A fish able to lift its head, brace its body and maneuver through obstacles would have advantages without ever leaving the water completely. There were also predators. Large fishes shared Devonian waters, and competition was intense. Moving into shallower zones could offer refuge, but it also demanded control in water too shallow for normal swimming. Bottom-based movement was one solution. The transition was not a straight ladder. Tiktaalik, a close relative of Tiktaalik described from similar Arctic rocks, appears to have retained or returned to a more open water lifestyle. Its fin anatomy was less suited for weight-bearing. Closely related animals could explore different ecological directions at the same time. This branching pattern is important. Transitional fossils are not necessarily direct ancestors. They are samples from a diverse evolutionary neighborhood. Some lineages may have moved towards shallower, more supportive locomotion. Others remained specialized swimmers. Only a fraction of these experiments contributed to later tetrapods. At the same time, the geological record reminds us that our sampling is incomplete. Footprints can occur millions of years before body fossils of the animals that made them. A lineage may exist for a long time in environments where skeletons are rarely preserved. The absence of fossils is not always the absence of animals. That problem becomes dramatic when we compare body fossils with Devonian trackways. Some tracks from Poland are around 390 million years old, considerably older than Tiktaalik and the classic late Devonian limbed tetrapods. If correctly interpreted, they show that digited tetrapod-like animals existed earlier than the most famous body fossils suggest. The relationship between those trackmakers and known tetrapodomorph fishes is still debated. Tracks tell us that a foot interacted with sediment. They do not give us a skull, spine, or complete limb. Yet they warn against turning a few famous fossils into a simple chronological chain. By the late Devonian, the boundary between fin and limb had become anatomically crowded. Some fishes had limb-like internal bones. Some tetrapods had digits but remained strongly aquatic. Different combinations of features appeared in different bodies. The next step was not simply gaining feet. It was discovering what feet were for. The famous finterlimb sequence also reminds us that bones do not acquire labels when they evolve. A humerus is not meaningful because it belongs to an arm. It is meaningful because of its relationships to muscles, joints, and neighboring bones. The same basic element can function inside a fin, a weight-bearing limb, a wing, or a flipper. Deep homology makes the transition look less like the invention of an entirely new structure and more like the repeated remodeling of an old one. And the earliest known feet do not look like they were designed for walking across dry land. Acanthostega is one of the fossils that most clearly overturned the old story of vertebrates marching from water onto land. It lived in Greenland about 365 million years ago and possessed limbs with digits. Yet much of its anatomy indicates an animal still deeply committed to aquatic life. Its limbs were relatively weak for supporting the body on land. The tail carried structures associated with swimming. The shoulder and rib anatomy did not resemble that of a fully terrestrial animal. Acanthostega had 8 digits on its limbs, reminding us that the familiar 5-fingered pattern was not fixed at the beginning. Digits, then, did not necessarily evolve for walking on dry ground. They may initially have helped animals maneuver through vegetation, push across shallow bottoms, or control the body in complex aquatic environments. The basic limb architecture existed before the terrestrial lifestyle we now associate with it. Ichthyostega, another late Devonian tetrapod from Greenland, was more robust. Its limbs and vertebral column could support more demanding movement, but recent reconstructions still suggest a locomotor style unlike that of modern salamanders. It was an early experiment, not a finished template. The distinction matters because evolution rarely assembles a complete adaptation in one step. Limbs, digits, neck mobility, ribs, lungs, sensory systems, and changes in the vertebral column did not have to appear simultaneously. Each could be useful in water, at the water's edge, or on land under different circumstances. Early tetrapods also retained aquatic feeding constraints. Many fishes capture prey by expanding the mouth cavity and sucking water inward. That strategy loses effectiveness in air because air and water behave differently. A land-feeding vertebrate needed new ways to position the head, tongue, and jaws around prey. Hearing changed too. Underwater sound travels efficiently through dense tissue and water. Airborne sound requires different mechanical solutions. The middle ear systems of later tetrapods emerged through transformations of bones and openings that had other functions in their fish-like ancestors. Even the spine faced a new problem. In water, buoyancy supports much of the body. On land, the vertebral column must resist bending between the limbs. The joints between vertebrae, the pelvis, and the connection between limbs and trunk all became increasingly important as tetrapods spent more time supporting their mass outside water. The foot itself also had to become a platform. A paddle can push water without transmitting the full body weight into the ground. A terrestrial foot must grip, stabilize, and redirect forces against a solid surface. Changes in digit proportions and joint orientation reflect this shift over time. Yet the fossil record is full of surprises. The famous trackways at Zaszelmy in Poland, dated to roughly 390 million years ago, are much older than Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. They appear to record animals with limbs and digits moving in shallow environments, perhaps even walking on exposed surfaces. Other Devonian trackways occur in Ireland and Australia. Together, they suggest that locomotor experiments were geographically widespread and that the body fossil record captures only part of the early tetrapod story. The animals that made some of these tracks remain unknown. That uncertainty is scientifically useful. It prevents us from treating Tiktaalik, Acanthostega, and Ichthyostega as a neat ancestor-to-descendant sequence. They are better understood as points within a much broader radiation, most of which remains unsampled. The late Devonian world was also unstable. Forest expansion changed rivers and soils. Several extinction pulses affected marine and freshwater ecosystems. The end Devonian crisis removed many vertebrate lineages and reorganized ecological communities just as tetrapods were diversifying. For a long time, scientists imagined that the extinction created a reset. Devonian tetrapods, often aquatic and anatomically unusual, seemed to disappear. Later Carboniferous forms looked more terrestrial and more closely related to the lineages that eventually produced modern amphibians and amniotes. Between those worlds lay a frustrating interval with few fossils, known as Romer's Gap. It once appeared to conceal the moment when tetrapods finally became competent land walkers. New discoveries have made the gap less empty, but it remains one of the most important missing intervals in vertebrate history. Before entering that gap, it is worth noticing how incomplete the transition still was. A late Devonian tetrapod might possess digits yet rely heavily on water. It might breathe air but feed more effectively underwater. It might support itself in the shallows while reproducing in aquatic habitats. Terrestrial life is therefore not a single trait. It is a bundle of challenges: locomotion, breathing, feeding, sensing, water balance, reproduction, and temperature control. Different lineages solved those problems in different sequences. The shore did not demand perfection. An animal only had to gain enough advantage to survive a little longer, travel a little farther, or exploit a niche competitors could not reach. Over millions of years, those partial solutions accumulated. Polydactyly among early tetrapods reinforces that point. Acanthostega's 8 digits and other early patterns show that the 5-digit condition familiar from most later tetrapods was selected from a broader field of possibilities. 5 was not a predetermined target. It became common only after early experiments had already produced bodies with different counts, proportions, and functions. The modern hand, therefore, preserves a stabilized solution, not the full range of evolutionary designs that once existed. Then the fossil record becomes quiet just when the story becomes most interesting. To understand why leaving water was difficult, imagine removing one invisible support after another. First, buoyancy disappears. The body becomes heavy. Then the gills begin to dry. Feeding by suction becomes ineffective. Heat changes more quickly. Water evaporates from exposed tissues. Smells, sounds, and light behave differently. Reproduction that depends on freestanding water becomes a constraint. Every successful land animal lineage solved some version of these problems, but not all at once. Early tetrapods could remain close to water while gradually improving terrestrial performance. A riverbank, swamp margin, or flooded forest provided a forgiving intermediate environment where an animal could use both worlds. The reasons for emerging were probably equally varied. Food is an obvious possibility. By the Devonian, arthropods had occupied the land for tens of millions of years. A vertebrate capable of snapping at prey near the shoreline could access resources unavailable to fully aquatic competitors. Escape offered another advantage. Shallow water could be a refuge from large aquatic predators. Moving across a mudflat or through a vegetated channel might allow a smaller animal to reach isolated pools. Even a brief ability to support the body in air could change which habitats were accessible. Seasonality may also have mattered in some environments. Floodplains expand and contract. Channels become disconnected. Water chemistry shifts. An air-breathing animal with robust appendages could survive conditions that trapped more specialized swimmers. But the old textbook image of fish crawling from a drying pond should not be treated as the universal cause. The relevant fossils come from different environments, and the transition unfolded across many lineages. No single ecological pressure explains all of them. Mechanical change was essential. The pectoral girdle gradually separated from the skull, creating a neck. The pelvis became more firmly integrated with the spine. Limb bones thickened and joints reoriented. Muscles increasingly transferred force from the ground through the skeleton instead of simply moving fins through water. The vertebral column also became better at resisting twisting and sagging. On land, each step transmits force into the trunk. Early tetrapods experimented with different vertebral constructions before later lineages settled into patterns that became more familiar. Breathing involved another mosaic. Air breathing evolved among fishes before terrestrial tetrapods. Lungs or lung-like organs were useful in stagnant water. The transition to land, therefore, reused a respiratory system that was already valuable in aquatic habitats. Skin was more difficult. Modern amphibians remain tied to moisture in part because their skin is permeable and important for respiration. Reptiles, birds, and mammals later evolved more effective barriers against water loss. Early tetrapods probably occupied a range between these conditions, but soft tissues rarely fossilize well enough to show exactly how their skin functioned. Feeding in air demanded behavioral and anatomical adjustment. Without a surrounding mass of water to carry prey into the mouth, the head had to become more mobile and the jaws more precisely controlled. The evolution of a neck, stronger tongue systems in later lineages, and changes in skull mechanics all contributed to terrestrial feeding. Vision changed as well. Light bends differently when passing from air into the eye than when passing from water. Early tetrapodomorphs show shifts in skull and eye position that may reflect life in shallow water, but fully terrestrial vision would require further adaptation. Smell offered opportunities. Airborne chemicals can carry information over distances, and later tetrapods developed increasingly sophisticated olfactory systems. But again, the sequence is difficult to reconstruct because the relevant soft tissues are inferred from bone rather than directly preserved. The most stubborn barrier was reproduction. An adult might walk across land, yet still need water for eggs and larvae. This is still true for many amphibians. Full independence from standing water required a reproductive system capable of protecting the embryo from drying. The amniotic egg became one major solution. Its membranes create a controlled environment around the embryo, while shells or other reproductive adaptations reduce dependence on open water. Mammals later transformed the system in different ways, but the origin of the amniote reproductive package was one of the decisive events in terrestrial vertebrate history. For decades, the earliest secure body fossils of amniotes seem to appear much later than the first tetrapods, around the middle to late Carboniferous. That created a long interval in which terrestrial competence appeared to increase step by step. The fossil record also encouraged scientists to think of early tetrapods as amphibian-like in development. Modern amphibians often hatch as aquatic larvae and transform during metamorphosis. It seemed plausible that the ancestors of reptiles, mammals, and amphibians passed through a similar stage, but fossils do not preserve expectations. In 2026, microscopic study of exceptionally young early tetrapods challenged the idea that a tadpole-like larva and dramatic metamorphosis were ancestral for the entire group. Some early forms appear to have developed more directly, with juveniles resembling smaller versions of adults in important ways. That discovery does not mean early tetrapods were fully terrestrial from birth. It means the developmental story was more diverse than the familiar frog model suggested. Just as anatomy evolved in a mosaic, life cycles did too. Water balance may have been as important as locomotion. Even an animal strong enough to crawl across a bank could lose water rapidly through skin, respiratory surfaces, and waste. Behavioral solutions probably came first in many cases, staying active at night, remaining near humid vegetation, retreating to pools, or using saturated soils. Physiological independence could then evolve gradually around those behaviors. Terrestriality was therefore partly about learning where and when to move, not simply about building stronger limbs. The shore was dangerous because every system of the body was being tested. It was productive because partial solutions were enough to create new ecological options. The animals that survived did not need to become modern. They only needed to become slightly less dependent on water than the generation before. At the end of the Devonian, ecosystems were shaken by a series of extinction events. Marine communities suffered badly, many major fish lineages disappeared, and freshwater systems changed. Tetrapods survived, but the record of what happened next was once frustratingly sparse. The interval became known as Romer's Gap, named for paleontologist Alfred Sherwood Romer. For roughly the earliest part of the Carboniferous, fossils of tetrapods were much less common than researchers wanted them to be. The gap seemed to separate aquatic-looking Devonian forms from a later radiation of more terrestrial animals. For a time, this absence encouraged a dramatic story. Extinction cleared ecological space, tetrapods emerged from water, and a new terrestrial fauna appeared. Discoveries over the last few decades have made the picture less tidy. Pedops, described from Scotland, is one important fossil from the early Carboniferous. Its foot shows a more terrestrial arrangement than the paddle-like limbs of many Devonian tetrapods. 5 robust digits dominated the foot, although early tetrapod digit counts were still more variable than the modern 5-digit pattern suggests. The anatomy of pedops indicates that more effective walking evolved during the interval traditionally hidden by Romer's Gap. It was not necessarily a fully land-bound animal, but it could place the foot in a way better suited to pushing against the ground. Other Scottish discoveries have filled the gap with a surprising range of forms. Some were elongated and aquatic. Some had stronger limbs. Some show combinations of features that do not fit easily into older categories. The early Carboniferous was not a corridor leading to one successful design. It was another evolutionary experiment zone. Watcheria, known from North America, represents a robust early tetrapod with powerful limbs and a large head. Greeropeton was more elongate and strongly aquatic. Different body plans persisted side by side, showing that water remained central even as some lineages improved terrestrial locomotion. Later early Carboniferous deposits, such as East Kirkton in Scotland, preserve extraordinary tetrapod diversity. By around 336 million years ago, vertebrates had evolved a range of limb shapes, body proportions, and locomotor strategies. The land-water boundary had become occupied by many specialists rather than a few transitional pioneers. The meaning of Romer's gap changed as more fossils appeared. It became less likely to represent a simple absence of tetrapods and more likely to reflect preservation, sampling, and geological exposure. Fossil records are not neutral archives. Some environments preserve bones well, others destroy them or remain buried and inaccessible. This lesson matters because evolutionary timelines are often built from first appearances. If the oldest known fossil of a group is 320 million years old, the group must be at least that old, but it may be much older. The fossil only gives a minimum age. Tracks can reveal this hidden history. A footprint can prove that an animal with a particular kind of foot existed even when no skeleton has been found. That is exactly why a small slab of sandstone from Australia became so important in 2025. Before that discovery, the broad picture placed the origin of crown amniotes much later in the Carboniferous. The oldest well-known body fossils, including Hylonomus from Nova Scotia, seemed consistent with an origin around that time. Molecular clocks also often estimated the split between the reptile bird lineage and the mammal lineage within the Carboniferous, although such estimates depend partly on fossil calibrations and model assumptions. Paleontology and molecular biology appeared to tell roughly compatible stories. Then came the Snowy Plains tracks. The slab was found in Victoria, Australia, in rocks from the earliest Carboniferous, probably between about 359 and 354 million years old. The impressions include long toes and distinct claw marks. Those claws are crucial because they strongly suggest an amniote, most likely an early member of the sauropsid branch. If that interpretation is correct, amniotes already existed almost at the Devonian Carboniferous boundary. Their lineage must therefore have originated earlier than the classic body fossil record indicates. And because amniotes sit within the crown group of tetrapods, the divergence of the major living tetrapod lineages must also be pushed deeper into the Devonian. The evolutionary tree does not allow the branches to appear after their descendants. The discovery, therefore, did more than move one date. It rearranged the hidden history around Romer's gap. Tetrapod diversification may have proceeded more rapidly and much earlier than the surviving skeletons had led researchers to believe. A gap in rock had been mistaken for a gap in evolution. The continuing recovery of fossils from the gap also illustrates why paleontologists revisit old collections as well as new field sites. A fragment collected decades ago can become informative when CT scanning. New comparative datasets or revised phylogenies reveal features that earlier researchers could not see. The early Carboniferous record is being rebuilt from both fresh discoveries and old specimens, given new context, making the apparent emptiness of Romer's gap smaller with each generation of work. The next chapter begins with the footprints themselves. The Snowy Plains track slab is small enough to be carried by one person. Its scientific effect is much larger. Preserved on fine sandstone are multiple footprints, including impressions where the ends of digits dragged or pressed into the sediment strongly enough to leave claw marks. The rock came from the Mansfield Group in Victoria, Australia, on Taungurung country. Geological evidence places the relevant Snowy Plains formation in the early Tuanasian, the first stage of the Carboniferous. The likely age range is roughly 359 to 354 million years. That puts the trackmaker very close to the end of the Devonian. Before the discovery, the best-known crown amniote evidence appeared tens of millions of years later. The new tracks therefore created a chronological problem that could not be solved simply by adding one new species to a list. Claws are common in early amniotes and uncommon in more primitive tetrapods. Combined with the shape of the feet and the trackway pattern, they led the research team to interpret the animal as a crown group amniote, probably a primitive sauropsid. Sauropsids are the broad lineage that includes reptiles and birds. If a sauropsid was walking in Australia at the beginning of the Carboniferous, then the split between sauropsids and synapsids, the lineage leading toward mammals, must already have happened. That pushes the origin of crown amniotes back by at least about 35 to 40 million years relative to the traditional body fossil timeline. It also forces the crown tetrapod split between the amphibian lineage and the amniote lineage deeper into the Devonian. The Nature study did not claim that every evolutionary date is now known precisely. In fact, the opposite is true. By revealing such an unexpectedly early footprint, it demonstrates how much of the relevant fossil history remains unsampled. The trackmaker's body is unknown. There is no skull beside the prints, no skeleton revealing its ribs, and no preserved egg proving how it reproduced. The identity rests on functional anatomy recorded indirectly in footprints. That makes the interpretation powerful, but also appropriately cautious. The geographic location matters too. The tracks come from what was then part of Gondwana. Early amniote evolution was once discussed largely from fossils in Euramerica because those rocks were better sampled. The Australian evidence warns that the origin and early spread of land vertebrates may have been geographically broader than the classic record suggested. The site lay in the tropics or subtropics of its time, not in the cool southern position modern Australia occupies today. Continental drift makes modern maps misleading when we imagine deep-time ecosystems. The tracks also change how we think about the end Devonian extinction. If crown tetrapods and perhaps crown amniotes were already diversifying before or around that boundary, the extinction did not simply create those groups afterward. It may still have reshaped their diversity, but the branches themselves were older. This is a recurring pattern in paleontology. New fossils often do not replace evolutionary theory. They refine its timing and reveal missing branches. The tree remains, but the dates move and the unsampled intervals become more obvious. Only a year after the track study, another discovery complicated a different part of the story. In 2026, researchers described exceptionally young fossil tetrapods, including baby embolomas, and examined their development in detail. The juveniles did not show the classic external gills and tadpole-like anatomy expected if a frog-style metamorphosis were ancestral for early tetrapods. Instead, the evidence supported more direct development in these stem tetrapods. That result challenges the familiar picture in which the earliest land vertebrates passed through a strongly amphibian-like larval stage and only later evolved a more direct life cycle. The evolution of metamorphosis appears to have its own history rather than simply representing the primitive condition for every tetrapod. The study does not make early tetrapods reptiles, nor does it mean water stopped mattering for reproduction. It means that the developmental diversity of early tetrapods was greater than a simple modern amphibian analogy allowed. Taken together, the 2025 tracks and the 2026 juvenile fossils produce a striking lesson. The move onto land was not just anatomically complex, it was temporally hidden. Major branches may have originated earlier than their skeletons reveal, and their life cycles may have differed from the models scientists used to reconstruct them. This does not make the history unknowable. It makes each new piece of evidence more valuable. A set of footprints can reveal a branch of the evolutionary tree. A tiny juvenile in a museum collection can overturn assumptions about development. The first land vertebrates were not a single type of creature moving along a single route. They were a radiation of bodies, behaviors, and life histories, testing how much of life could be moved away from water. Citizen science is part of the Snowy Plains story as well. The slab was recognized and brought to scientific attention by non-professional discoverers before specialists analyzed the track anatomy and geological context. In a field where one rare surface can alter a global evolutionary timeline, careful observation outside universities can matter enormously. The fossil record is too sparse and too geographically scattered for discovery to belong to professional paleontologists alone. By the later Carboniferous, some of those experiments would become permanent. True independence from water did not arrive the moment a vertebrate could walk. Many tetrapods became excellent terrestrial movers while remaining tied to aquatic or very moist environments for reproduction. The decisive change was not simply stronger legs. It was the ability to carry the next generation through development without placing the embryo directly in open water. The amniotic reproductive system solved that problem. The embryo developed inside a set of membranes that managed gas exchange, waste, and protection. In egg-laying forms, an enclosing shell and albumen could provide further protection from drying and mechanical damage. Later mammals internalized parts of this system in very different ways. Because eggs and soft membranes fossilize poorly, the exact origin of the amniotic egg is difficult to pinpoint. We infer its presence from the evolutionary relationships and terrestrial habits of early amniotes rather than from a single first egg preserved in rock. For much of modern paleontology, Hylonomus from the famous fossil forests of Joggins, Nova Scotia, stood near the beginning of the secure amniote body fossil record. It lived around 315 million years ago and was a small, lightly built animal that would not look dramatic beside the giant predators of later eras. Its importance lies in what such small animals represent. Once reproduction became less dependent on open water, vertebrates could spread into habitats unavailable to amphibian-grade relatives. Drier uplands, seasonal environments, and inland food webs became more accessible. The early amniote split eventually produced two enormous branches. Sauropsids gave rise to reptiles and birds. Synapsids led, through a long series of extinct forms, to mammals. Every bird in the sky and every mammal on land belongs to a story whose deep roots lie in these Carboniferous experiments. The 2025 Australian footprints suggest those roots are substantially older than Hylonomus. The visible body fossil record is therefore only the later chapter of a lineage that had already diversified by the earliest Carboniferous. That realization changes the emotional scale of a footprint. A few clawed impressions in sandstone are not merely evidence that an animal crossed wet ground. They imply that major branches leading eventually to lizards, birds, mammals, and countless extinct lineages had already separated while the world was still recovering from the Devonian. Terrestrial ecosystems were also becoming more structured. Carboniferous forests created deep shade, fallen logs, leaf litter, swamp pools, and dry patches. Arthropods diversified in abundance and size. Insects developed flight. Food webs grew more complex, and vertebrates entered roles as predators, insectivores, and eventually herbivores. Yet there was no final victory over water. Even the most terrestrial animals still depended on it physiologically. Blood, cells, and embryos preserve the chemistry of an aquatic ancestry. The conquest of land was never an escape from water so much as the evolution of ways to carry water within the body. This is visible in ourselves. Our limbs follow the basic tetrapod pattern assembled in Devonian fishes and early limbed vertebrates. Our neck reflects the separation of skull and shoulder seen in transitional forms. Our lungs belong to a respiratory history that began before vertebrates walked on land. Even the architecture of our hands retains the legacy of ancient experiments with digits. 5 became standard in most later tetrapod lineages, but fossils like Acanthostega show that early evolution explored other counts. The modern pattern is one survivor among several possibilities. The same is true of development. The 2026 study of early tetrapod juveniles reminds us that the familiar frog tadpole is not a simple window into the universal ancestral state. Modern species preserve parts of history, but none is a living fossil frozen, unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Paleontology works by combining imperfect archives. Bones reveal anatomy, tracks reveal movement, sediments reveal habitat, geochemistry reveals environments, developmental biology and genetics constrain relationships. Each source has blind spots, and the strongest reconstructions emerge when they agree without being forced into a simple narrative. The move onto land is one of the clearest examples. For generations, it was told as a ladder, fish, amphibian, reptile. The real history is a branching landscape. Some fish evolved tetrapod-like features and remained aquatic. Some early tetrapods had digits but swam. Some lineages improved walking. Others evolved direct development. Amniotes may have appeared much earlier than expected. There was never a single first step that transformed the world. There were countless small departures from the old rules. Breathing air in stagnant water, bracing a fin against mud, lifting a head independently, carrying weight through a limb, crossing a damp bank, laying an embryo in a protected environment. The continent changed around those animals as well. Plants built soils and forests. Arthropods created terrestrial food webs. Rivers became more stable and more complex. Extinctions removed competitors and rearranged ecosystems. Evolutionary opportunity came from the interaction of biology and geology, not from anatomy alone. And that is why the transition matters beyond the origin of legs. It was the moment vertebrate life became geographically larger. Rivers and seas were no longer boundaries in the same way. Entire continents became potential habitat. Hundreds of millions of years later, tetrapods would run across deserts, climb trees, burrow underground, return to the oceans, and eventually fly. Mammals would evolve beneath dinosaurs. Birds would inherit the skies. And one primate lineage would learn to read the fossils left by all the others. Once amniotes diversified, terrestrial vertebrate evolution accelerated into niches that earlier tetrapods could barely use. Some lineages became better runners, others specialized for digging, climbing, or feeding on plants, and some eventually returned to water with bodies remodeled for swimming. Leaving the water did not close an evolutionary door. It created a larger set of doors, including the possibility of returning to aquatic life with lungs, limbs, and ancestry permanently shaped by a terrestrial phase. But none of that future was visible in the first muddy tracks. There was only a body testing its weight against the ground, a shoreline ahead, and a world that had just become possible.